Suzanne Nossel. I'm delighted to be here. I'm presiding over this discussion with Heather Conley and Ivo Dalder. We're going to bring home this fascinating seminar that's been taking place this afternoon. Just to kick it off for both of you, do you think this notion of a kind of quadrangle of authoritarian powers, China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, is that a useful framing or not? There's been a lot of debate about that this afternoon. And where do you guys come down?
Go ahead.
I think it is useful. There's so many names for it. I think it's useful for us to understand an alignment of America's adversaries, how they interact, and what the evolution of their objectives will become. I think it's valid. I think you can't throw too much on it, but I think it's a worthwhile framework.
So I thought it was a useful framework until January 2025, when the United States decided to join the axis of autocracy.
We are going to have so much fun.
And quite serious about this. I actually do think the United States looks at its role in the world in a very different way than the framing of the axis of autocracies started out with, which was this idea that we have adversaries who either collectively or individually between them were trying to support each other, probably more bilateral rather than multilateral among the four. And it was a pretty useful framework. In fact, Jim Lindsay and I started a working group at the council to sort of figure out how the U.S. should respond to it. But the U.S., I think this U.S. today does not necessarily look at these 4 countries in the same way. It regards 2 of them, China and Russia, as peer powers, as opposed to maybe potential adversaries, but not necessarily adversaries. I don't think anybody's been talking about North Korea for a long time, at least not for the last 8-9 weeks. And Iran is actually a very interesting conversation one can have, but it's just a very different framework for the way that this administration is approaching the role of the world. So,
well, one of the points that was made in an earlier discussion was that the Biden administration's framing of democracies versus autocracies itself was kind of the imposition of a worldview, and the Trump administration has a different worldview. It's much more transactional. It's less values-oriented. It has less affinity for governments that have similar systems and democratic norms. And that this is part of a move toward a much more multipolar, kind of less value-laden system, less black and white, less perhaps polarized. And I wonder if you give any credence to that notion.
So I do. I mean, I don't think we have to put any values one versus the other. I do think that this administration, this president in particular, no longer looks at the internal characteristics of states as a defining element in their foreign policy, i.e., they're not liberal in the true small L sense of the word liberal. And that is a huge it's one of the big departures of American foreign policy since the 1940s, which we have pursued for over 80 years. And it's fully legitimate. I mean, I come from Chicago, and at the University of Chicago, we have people like John Mearsheimer who've been arguing that the world should be thought about in terms of the relative distribution of power among big states and not about the internal characteristics of states. That's perfectly fine as a framework, and I don't have any problem with the Trump administration trying to frame its foreign policy in that way. Not sure it's pursuing it in the way that I would pursue it, even if I believed in this framework, which I don't. I don't think they're doing a particularly good job at projecting power or husbanding it or keeping it. But that's a separate issue. As an analytical framework, arguing that we should look at the world according to the distribution of power as opposed to the internal makeup of states, I think it's perfectly legitimate as a way to think of it, and one way in which Biden and the 13 other presidents who came before them, and this president may be slightly different.
I mean, how would you put succinctly, because I do quickly see sort of the conversation about this morphing. And even in today's discussion, there's much more kind of acceptance of this alternative paradigm than there would have been even a few months ago. How would you, Ivo, put most succinctly, why it is that you think the shift to this paradigm, though perfectly sort of defensible, perhaps, as a matter of logic or theory, why it poses risks for U.S. interests?
Well, at its most succinctly, it's because it misunderstands power. It looks at power as a resource and sort of adds up all the resources and said, if I got more than you, I got more power than you, which means I can tell you what to do and you will do what I tell you to do in a Thucydidean way. But as even Athens learned over time, it just doesn't work that way. Power is not just a resource, it's a relationship. You only exercise power over someone else. And that someone else has not only resources, it has agency. And they may exercise that agency in a way that is contrary to the power relationship that you would think. So if you look at Canada, just take an example out of thin air, it should be submitting to the United States, which has almost 10 times its population, probably 5 or 6 times, 7 times its economy, as President Trump's like to say, has been providing for its security for hundreds of years. Not quite sure whether we were the ones providing for the security of Canada, but that's nevertheless. And so it should be able to tell the Canadians what to do. And turns out the Canadians say, no, we won't do it. And in fact, the political situation in Canada has fundamentally changed, and its ability to submit to the United States has changed. And so when you look at power as a resource, you don't understand this outcome. But that's how, real estate agents who are not particularly good at negotiating deals look at the world.
Heather, what do you say? Do you have sort of more time for this paradigm shift? And do you believe the autocracies versus democracies remains the right frame?
So I definitely have more time for it because the international system has been in flux for about 15 years. We're in a period of transition where the 80-year-old structures, we're not being able to be sustained in a way. The economic system, the lack of reform in international organizations. So this system, sticky and strong for all those important values, we're starting to give way because the system wasn't reforming. So I think this is why we are all grasping. We don't quite know whether we're going back to 19th century balance of power, sphere of influence, that may be the system we're evolving to. It may be a hybrid mashup, but this is why I think we have to take these frames really seriously because we are experiencing a transition of which we don't know how this is going to work. And as Ivo said, the Trump administration is clearly having a dramatic rethink on the international economic system, of which we've just seen over the last few years, the international security system, whether the United States will play the role it has played for the last 80 years. I think it will pull back. So yeah, that's why we're having this conversation, because other powers will either seize opportunity, middle powers in particular, they'll be flexible, they'll be nimble, they will achieve their aims, while we may have a great power constellation. And I think this is why watching the US-Russian agreement over Ukraine, to me, will tell us volumes about how this system may potentially shift. I never thought the autocracy-democracy was the right framing. I think we have to speak in language that is open to all, understanding to all. But I think we have to prepare the American people for this is a massive transition. Some of it we're fueling, some of it's already been undertaken. And what do they want? What are they willing to pay for? What are they willing to defend? And we may be surprised at some of those answers.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's no question we're not going back to some kind of status quo ante.
We're not going back.
The clock is not going to unwind. And, in some ways you could see discussion today is an extension of Tony Blinken's variable geometry, where we're talking about minilateralism and every country hedging their bets with all sorts of relationships. I want to pick up on your point about the U.S. and Russia. There's been a lot of talk this afternoon about whether this is what people are calling a reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon to China. Is this Trump engaging with Russia ultimately as a hedge against China, and something that both the United States and the Russians ultimately have an interest in, given China's power, over both countries.
I'll answer quickly and turn to Ivo. I think that it's not. We're using terms that I don't think people understand. So, reverse Nixon or Kissinger.
Only at the Council on Foreign
Well,
Relations.
no, and I love that. But I'm just saying, note, we have got to speak more accessibly to allow people to come into this conversation. So just for all of us as a good reminder, no, this is strongmanism. This is an admiration for a power structure. And this has been an anathema to the United States for those 80 plus years, although we've imperfectly and have flexed our own muscles, whether that's Iraq and, in more modern times. But this is an attraction to control and power and seizing what you want. And what we don't know is how far we have to go. I mean, I follow the Arctic very, very closely. I am watching a conversation on Greenland that speaks to that great powers seize what they want for their own needs. That's Mr. Putin's view of, obviously, Ukraine. That is Beijing's view of more complicated for Taiwan. If that's the world we're going towards, which we may be flexing that, we have to be prepared for those consequences, or we may not.
Well, let me just challenge you for a second and say, maybe the motivation is this sort of bromance, but could the consequence be, a more stable kind of trilateral situation where both China and the United States have a stronger relationship with Russia? And as part of the discussion earlier was that, while Putin may never buy into this, sort of the next generation of Russians may be looking this way as a hedge against Beijing.
Well, let's Ivo.
So one, I agree we should speak in English. Nixon was a friend of mine. No, he wasn't. I'll just say this, that Donald Trump is no Richard Nixon. And so the idea that this is a grand strategic, thing remember, Richard Nixon wrote this idea first in Foreign Affairs, by the way. The idea that Donald Trump would write anything in Foreign Affairs is in and of itself an interesting concept. But I do think this strongman is very much the framework that he has. This idea that there are three powers who truly matter. I think Donald Trump way overestimates Russian power. I think he regards Russian power as more powerful than Vladimir Putin does, which is dangerous, which is why he's accommodating him in all kinds of ways. But he does believe that Putin's Russia, Xi's China, and Trump's West America, and when I say America, I mean America, not the United States of America, Trump's America, are three equal powers who should have their own sphere of influence within which they would pretty much do whatever they want. And I think that
It's the new Yalta.
in that sense, it's the new Yalta. I've been asking my kids, because I don't understand AI, can we do a picture of the famous Yalta, but then replace it with Trump, Xi, and Putin? We're actually probably going to get this on May 9th on
That's my
Red
prediction.
Square, which is what I think
Yep.
the three of them will be there, because Trump will be so desperate to have this conversation with Xi that Xi's not willing to have with him, that he'll actually fly to Moscow to do it. That was a parenthetical in there. The question is it stable? And the answer to that is highly unlikely for two fundamental reasons. One, it's not at all clear to me that the Chinese are buying into the idea that their sphere of influence is somehow limited in the geographical way that we would like it to be limited, which, by the way, we have not said how. Does the sphere include Taiwan? Probably. Does it include Japan? I don't know. And it probably is a good idea that we have some agreements where the sphere goes. I think it includes, in the U.S. side, Guam and Hawaii, but I'm not really sure about that either. So that one is part of it. But the more important one is that the Chinese have extraordinary influence in both the European sphere and the American sphere. And they're not going to give it up. In fact, the more this United States plays the game we're playing, say with Mexico and Canada, and with other parts of Central and South America, the more influential this Chinese are going to be in this part of the world, the one that, quote, we own. So that's the problem. The same is true in Europe. And Heather and I could talk for the next 3 hours about how it's never going to work in Europe because the Ukrainians aren't even willing to live with the Russians. We really think that the Europeans are going to be part of a Russian sphere of influence? Not in Steve Witkoff's wildest dreams would that come up. So I just don't see it as stable. That's the problem I have with this policy because it won't work and certainly won't work for the United States.
What about the Europeans who are now trying to pivot in response to these rapidly shifting alignments? How do you see them ultimately playing their cards here? Is it just, do they move toward at least kind of a two-way hedging with China and the United States?
Well, it's interesting. Commissioner Dombrovskis is in Beijing right now, having come to Washington to try to understand the tariff negotiation and now going. And of course, the Chinese diplomacy, it gets so easy. We're here to be stable. We're the stable power. And I want to talk a little bit about that because that's the evolution that we could see. Europe right now, and with our Indo-Pacific allies, are sort of holding hands and trying to hold the 80-year-old system that they've understood and benefited from, and which kept the peace and stability for them. The question is, can they do it alone? And I don't know the answer to that. I think what we're seeing in today, and President Macron and the European Reassurance Force for Europe, you're seeing an attempt. Will it be sustained? Do they have the defense and military capabilities without the United States? I don't think they can sustain it. Are they economically strong enough to endure it? I don't know. But I think that's the role they're playing. Can they hold on long enough until either we experiment with something and we decide, I don't want to, or we start shifting the system? And then I do think, Ivo, then it grows more difficult. And Europe is fragmented. Northern and Eastern Europe have clarity on security and defense. Southern Europe is much more focused on economic competitiveness, and there is some contestation about the Chinese, whether that's Spain, whether that, so I think this is, you already have, Hungary as an absolute outpost of Chinese investment in Europe. So it's going to be very, very dynamic.
Do you think, Heather, we were talking a few minutes ago about the imperative of kind of adapting to these new circumstances and looking for the silver linings and demonstrating resilience. Do you think the Europeans and perhaps Japan and South Korea are too fixated on trying to prop up the old system? Is there a way for them to get ahead of whatever's next? Or are they sort of inevitably in receive mode just to see how things work out between the three bigger powers?
I think right now they're in cope mode. Trying to manage, trying to see if they can mitigate the damage that we're causing to them and we're causing to ourselves, particularly with the tariffs. I think that's right now front and center. I think what will be interesting over time, and this is, again, we're starting to see there will be cost to this because our nationalism is creating their nationalism and protectionism and keeping the United States out of future European defense capabilities. This terrible rumor, and it is a rumor, there's no kill switch, but it's starting like, I can't trust you anymore. And I wish someone would do a great study calibrating the cost of the lack of trust, because that meter is moving minute by minute. And that is the number I want to give to the American people and their jobs and the connectivity, because we can't rebuild it. It's like my father said, when you drop a vase, you can glue it back together, but it's never as strong. It's got cracks. It'll always be fragile. You can't drop it again. It'll leak. That's our future, rebuilding our credibility. My silver lining is, look, there were a lot of inefficiencies in our system that rebuilding properly and very focused on our national priorities will benefit us enormously. It's just going to be very painful to get there. Our European partners and allies, the tragedy for them and for us is that it took this. it took this. And now they are very serious. The Swedes are going to spend 3.5% on GDP on defense spending. Denmark just announced 3.2%. Polls report. I mean, yes, but we have a timeline problem because this has to happen now, and it needed to start 10 years ago to be able to prepare for the instability that is coming. And I think that's the rub here. Will they be able to meet that timeline? And how much will they stand up without the United States? And then the cost of that in the future, unknowable.
Ivo?
No, that's exactly right. I'm a Euro optimist on this. I actually think that the last 6 weeks have been the most important, enlightening parts of for Europe. Started on the 12th of February with the phone call that the president had with Vladimir Putin. Went to Pete Hegseth's speech at NATO through the Munich Security Conference, and thereafter, they now know that
It's
the
clear.
base is broken.
It's clear.
It's done, and no one believes it anymore. There is not a single person who thinks that you can go back to the status quo. I don't think that's true in Asia yet, though Pete Hegseth is in Japan as we speak, so he'll soon. We will find out. I think I got to look at my signal to see what it says, but we will soon find out how that relationship is treated. So on the European side, I agree that the glue is actually what Brussels now talks about, which is the twin threat. The twin threat used to be Russia and China. The twin threat is now Russia and the United States, very seriously. The piece that will splinter it is the point you made, which is China. If the Chinese play their cards well, and unfortunately, they have a tendency to do that, particularly when their cards are so easily handed over to them by the President of the United States, they can split the Europe because the Europeans are in a security crisis with Russia and pending economic crisis with the United States. And if they then also have an economic competition, not just de-risking, but a real competition with the Chinese, they may find themselves. Those are three things that are a little too big to chew. And so some will say, and I think you're right, some of the southern countries or some of the East European countries will say, no, we can't afford to fight three. We just need to do two. So that's one part. The second part is when, and I think it's a question of when, Japan and Australia understand, to some extent South Korea, they have a harder just geographic position, to understand that actually they need to see the world the same way that Canada and Europe do now, which I think may happen in the next few weeks. There is a question that I raise, that I have in my own mind. Can you actually have Canada, the European Union writ large, including Britain and others, and the strong East Asian allies work together to not preserve the old order, because the old order is a US-run order, but at least among themselves create an order that upholds some critical values. Jim and I wrote a piece in 2018, call it the Committee to Save the Free World, to talk about that these countries should do this until the end of the Trump administration. Never thought we'd be able to do it forever, but that's actually where we might need to go when it gets back to this question of values. There's still plenty of liberal countries that believe at their core that security depends on the internal structures of your neighbors, and these countries may find ways to cooperate. The Canadians are moving very hard to try to see, is there a trade deal to be had between the EU and the CPTPP? And if you're Japan or Canada, and you're the EU, by the way, the EU has a deal with Japan, it has a deal with Canada, it's about to sign a deal with Australia, and India, there is this alternative power structure on the economic side that's kind of interesting. And if the Chinese overplay their hand, that makes it more
Which they tend to
likely.
do.
By the way, that's the world that I'd like to be part of, that one.
Well, and I would say even just that is one of the really important, if we can, not right now, is a great U.S. response to this adversarial alignment. You just outlined it. It is creating new bridges between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific that and this is, we've been trying to do it, but not well. And maybe this will force us to do it because we have our Indo-Pacific quads and we have our transatlantic quads, and we need, and the G20s and things. We need that global alliance. It's not a NATO, but it's a global alliance for managing a very fluid and transitional international system. And we've got to do a better job of thinking about how to flex into that and how to create it.
Yeah, at the UN, we used to call that the WEOG, the Western Europe and Elder Group, and it was all
Boy, needs a better
the
acronym.
like-minded.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure the free world can be saved by committee, but we may find out. Just to go to the question of sort of regime type, though. Look, democracy has been in decline for, I think it's now 19 consecutive years globally. The world is witnessing American democracy, which was always the paradigm, now succumbing to corruption and self-dealing and a lack of accountability and the disabling of 1 to 2 branches of our government. So how does it withstand? How does the idea?
We only have 3.
So how does the idea endure, survive that? This notion that this is the best system.
Well, I think things. I guess we are going to test a lot of assumptions, and we're going to painfully learn what tariffs mean. And I hope people then have an understanding of what that means and make their choices. We're going to have, I fear, we are having a real understanding of loss of independence of our branches of government and the weakening of those institutions to a point. The people are going to have to decide if that is what they want. These are all going to be tested. They've been tested for very long. As we started down this sliding path, I always felt, and Suzanne, you've been involved in this, a lot of international programs for rule of law, anti-corruption, transparency. I never felt, and this is a silver lining thing, so just be with me. I'm just trying to think positive thoughts here. That we never were successful when we wagged our finger. We always were more successful to say, we struggle with this. We're imperfect. We haven't gotten this right. Let's work on this together. Let's fight this together if you come to that conclusion. But you're right, it's utterly depressing that we're flaunting golden visas when we work so closely with the Cypriots and others to say, no, that is just floodgates of corruption and malign influence. Please don't do that. It's completely disheartening. But this is what we were talking about. You can curse your darkness, or you can start rolling out your blueprint. Well, what do we want to build? Because this is coming down here. So what's the international system that we want? What are the values? What's worth this? And this is where I feel we have to connect back to the American people. We've disconnected. They have to understand what's important, what they're willing to invest in, and we have to continue to have a conversation with them. But if they don't see the linkages now between their jobs and tariffs and security and cyber attacks and malign actors, we just have a ton of work to do.
Let me put it slightly different while completely agreeing in the end at this, which is, and to your question, I do think that the United States, as the longest constitutional democracy in history, has, and because of the way it has conducted itself since December 7, 1941, has had an outsized role in reminding people the importance of democracy, basic ideas about the rule of law, and how central it is to economic and political progress. And the proof, if I can make it personal, lies in people like me. I'm an immigrant. I came to this country because it was a beacon of hope. I came from Europe, so it's hardly, not that I came from a place that was in despair, to the contrary. But if you had to think in Europe in the 1960s about where would you want to go, you would want to go to American universities. You want to go to the place where there was the opportunity for you. Many of the German politicians today came here as exchange students to high school and other places, certainly people in my age. I came here to go to university with the very specific intent to want to stay. Yes, I know I had a Fulbright scholarship, needed to do all kinds of visa things that probably will now get me deported. But there was a certain sense of what this country was about, an attractiveness, what Joe Nye used to call soft power. That's real. It's fundamental. And we're doing an amazing job of just destroying it all in every single way. Anybody who, I mean, how could you have missed? But if you didn't see the video of a Fulbright scholar at Tufts University being picked up by a bunch of hooligans and balaclavas who happened to be apparently federal agents and revoked visa, this is not the country that I wanted to become a part of. And so our ability as a country to set an example, to be that, as Joschka Fischer just said the other day, great green politician, to be that shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan, one of the great speeches, his farewell speech, talked about in depth. That's a big deal. And so when you think about, do we really want to live in a world where the relative power of countries, by the way, defined in military, population, and economic terms, is determinative, as opposed to who we are to our own people and to the people who are in our country? You know what? I opt for the latter. I just think it's a better place. At least it's the one that I came to, wanted to be part of. And, you know, if it's not the place, then people start asking, is this the place we want to be? That's a different.
I mean, Americans are starting to ask that. American
Yes, well, I
scientists
am an
and
American.
scholars are.
I am an American, and in fact, that's what America is, a nation of immigrants that came here for different circumstances to believe in the land of opportunity. And some came last week, and some came on the Mayflower, but they all came for the same reason. And oh, by the way, some of them were here already for a long time, so I don't want to forget those. But that's what it means to be an American. And if now what it means to be an American is that if you say something that the government doesn't like, that you can be, you know, and you have a green card, you can be picked up. And by the way, soon naturalized American citizen. I'm not kidding. Because you say things that are not liked, then that's a different country.
All right, it's on that poignant note, I'm going to open it up to our group here in New York.
I knew I was going to be uplifting. I thought it was just kind of my nature.
Question in the back there. Yes, in the red. Thank you.
Thank you for this. My name is Viviana Mazza. I'm the U.S. correspondent for Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. I wanted to ask a question about Europe because, you know, the Signal chat that you referenced several times showed us this way of talking about Europe, right? And it's not just Pete Hegseth, it's also, to some extent, Mike Waltz, when he says, you know, this exceptionalism view of the US, it's the only country that can help, but also they have to pay, you know, so it's everybody basically in that group to some extent. But I want to know, you know, to what extent you think Americans and the, you know, of course you don't share that view, but talking like this about Europe is, I don't think it's going to damage them politically, and that there is a reason probably for that. So, I mean, people in this country, have they come to view this wars abroad and somehow Europe in negative terms, in your opinion? And the second part of the question is, being Italian, I would like to ask you, what suggestions would you give to our Prime Minister, who is viewed as a bridge or a possible bridge between the US and Europe, who is probably about at some point to come to visit Donald Trump?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me talk about public opinion. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which I've had the privilege to run for the last 12 years, has been publishing public opinion data for the last 50 years. And although there's in the last few years, really started under Trump 1, a growing partisan divide on certain issues, including on issues like NATO, and just put out a poll on Ukraine. Overall, the majority of Americans retain a view of America's role in the world that is quite consistent with the dominant view of America's role in the world for the last 80 years. They are pro-alliances, they're pro-NATO. They think, like every American, that Europeans need to pay more for defense. By the way, that is not a unique view. It started with Harry Truman, ever heard of him? Who actually in 1952 said that 60% of the divisions that NATO needed to be provided by the Europeans. Never happened. And I spent 4 years really hitting my head against the table on demanding more money from the Europeans. So it's not unique to Donald Trump. And Americans fundamentally believe in burden sharing. What they don't believe in is that the best way to get Europeans to pay more, and we've actually asked this question repeatedly, is by threatening to withhold security guarantees. What they do, they believe in diplomacy and persuasion. They don't believe in threats. And so now that may change because public opinion is in some ways fickle and in some ways can be led. And there's no doubt that Republican opinion has changed quite fundamentally over the last 10 years. And the reason is because the President of the United States has had a different view, and he can lead his own public opinion. And indeed, Democrats are more pro-NATO than they've ever been in history, which is also related to the fact that Donald Trump is more anti-NATO than any president in the last 76 years. So I think that's how to look at it. Ultimately, what matters, I think, is not what public opinion thinks about these issues, but what their leaders tell them about these issues. And in that regard, this Signal chat is atrocious. It's horrific because it basically says that we, the United States, will help other countries if you pay us. I don't know anybody who joins the U.S. military, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Coast Guard, or Army, to become a military for hire. Not why you join the military. Not why you join public service. You don't do it for other countries. You do it for yourself and for your own country. And so I find it deeply, deeply disturbing. In many ways, I think what we read from how people thought about that was in some ways worse than the thing that everybody is talking about in terms of classified or not, war plan or not, which is terrible in and of itself.
Well, I'll answer the Prime Minister Maloney question since.
I wanted to leave that to you.
Yeah. Oh no. Go ahead. I think this is the humble advice that Americans should offer our European colleagues right now.
Yeah.
I mean, every step must be designed to strengthen Italy, strengthen Europe. So that's every decision, and that's increasing defense spending now, absolutely, increasing economic competitiveness, absolutely. That must be done. I think the tensions that are playing out, and I would say this is President Macron of France versus Prime Minister Maloney, whether the view is we must do this by ourselves, this is Europe alone, strategic autonomy, or this is we have to make sure we give space to allow a continuation of the transatlantic relationship, even if that door is closed. I think that is where she is strong to keep that open. I hope we don't slam the door ourselves. I hope there is a path back. It will be a different path than what we've been, but a path back. I mean, Mr. Trump has a very specific worldview. He's had it for decades that allies are a drain. And this comes back from his, if you are winning, I am losing. And that's just a worldview. And his cabinet reflects that worldview and tries to outdo each other and how they explain that. But I'm going to go back to, and I'm so glad you noted the public opinion. I think we have a bit of a disconnect here. We have people that understand liberty and values. They understand Ukraine, and that's protecting freedom. They understand that it doesn't feel good when the US doesn't have friends and partners with us and that we are showing that leadership. And then break. There is this ecosystem, this media ecosystem that has filled their ears with all the bad, that the allies are a drain and we need to be paid back and all that. If we don't penetrate that, it doesn't matter what these public opinion polls are necessarily until they mobilize and galvanize. And that's why I said, I'm sorry, I'm a total broken record. Until we reconnect the American people with their foreign policy, that they believe in it, that they support, and that they understand, and they want some skin in that game, and they know what's right, and they feel it is part of helping themselves, we're going to keep doing this over and over and over again, I fear. We've got to attack it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tall order, though. You know, it's one thing to use social media to rile people up against an enemy and say, well, they're freeloaders. It's another to say, no, this is a rational policy that makes sense and will serve us over a period of decades. I don't think anyone has squared
They have
that circle. And so,
Absolutely
you know,
haven't.
I don't disagree with you.
First thing is to point out that when the Vice President of the United States says that he hates bailing out Europe again, and when the Secretary of Defense says that Europe is, quote, pathetic,
in capitals.
and in capitals, and the National Security Advisor, who can't spell, not only doesn't know how to spell principles, but just doesn't know how to spell, apparently thinks there's a whole list of horribles of what the Europeans had, to point out that actually the Europeans have a Navy capability in the Red Sea that is designed to help, and it's just been extended for another year, that is designed to protect shipping in the Red Sea, that many of them have participated in direct military confrontations against the Houthis, and that no one asked the United States to open up the sea lines of communication, which, by the way, are no longer being used because most of the companies that are actually shipping this stuff have already decided it's easier and cheaper and quicker to go around the Cape of Good Hope rather than to go through the Suez Canal. And so the degree of disdain that was in these, but more importantly, the self-importance. The self-importance. We're the only ones who can do that. Well, you know, we're still bombing and it ain't working. But we're actually not the ones who can do that. And is remarkable. And what it does, and you're from Italy, so you know, and I haven't read the Corriere della Sera in the last couple of days, but if I were, I can guaranteed that this kind of stuff is front page news, and it is driving Europeans just to say no mas in a very good Spanish part of the world.
Okay.
Non più, to put it in those terms. And start to have a response that is going to be bad for the United States because we need allies and we need partners, which we used to think we understood.
Rita Hauser.
Thank you very much for your participations. It's remarkable to me that at nearing the end of 3 hours, there hasn't been a single mention, not one, of immigration, of the borders. I don't think I heard, no, you are an immigrant, but I mean about the immigration problem. What does that do both for our partners and allies and us? Where does this all circle in how public opinion is formed? You know, the Europeans, all of them now are engaged in no more. We're not taking in anybody else. So what the hell happens between everybody in dealing with this issue as part of the world we live in and how we relate to our neighbors and friends? I mean, even the Canadians who took in gazillions of people, no more, you know, everybody's going to spend on their own defense. Against what? Against Russia? I mean, what do we do to deal with our own in that? And the second problem, with no mention at all here, the great America, et cetera, about the change in race relations that are coming. So that America will not be this always glorious country that everybody emulates. I can't compute all these problems together is my problem. And something terrible is going to happen on one of them that's going to explode.
I think on immigration, it is certainly in the transatlantic space, has caused enormous concerns, security concerns. It has also fueled the rise of our far-right groups, for sure. Both, I mean, I think we both have a similarity there, and has certainly fed this view of, we need strong leaders, broad category, to take control of our borders to ensure sovereignty and territorial integrity. At the same time, the economics of this are so interesting because as advanced democracies, their demographic pictures shift dramatically. They need highly skilled immigration to employ and to build those factories as we try to reshore. And this is where there's going to be such a competition for talent and skills. And so exactly as Eva was talking about, the United States has enormous power, attractive power, and universities and research. But if we no longer are attractive power, I just was at a dinner last evening with some senior German colleagues. They've seen an uptick at 25% in skilled immigration to Germany. There's going to be a real competition for that great talent, and that is our economic future. So we have to be very careful. While I'm a strong proponent of strong national security, is making sure we know who comes into our borders, that we have control over that. But we also can't lose sight of that the wonderful talents that we need to do to make us thrive as an economy has to be part of it. And we've lost, I think, that ability. But until this sort of burns out one way or the other, it's absolutely a shaping feature in all advanced democracies, particularly as demographic pictures change so dramatically and populations shift. Even the United States, the population shifts will continue to shape the politics of the United States for some time. So it's affecting all advanced democracies. I don't know if anyone has a great answer for it, but it's certainly a shaping feature and will be a shaping feature of the international system.
And a big challenge to liberalism as well.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, the only way this is going to end is badly, because the only answer to this problem that we have is through immigration. It's that simple. We know that immigration, that the constant change in bringing in other people is what has made for the last 70, 80 years, in the United States case, really for the last 150 years, the country who we are. But it's true for Germany, it's true for every country in the world. And at some point, the rubber will hit the road. The Germans will not be able to spend €1 trillion, which is what they're going to do, unless they figure out how they're going to get more people to work. And the only place where you're going to get people to work is not in Germany. It's going to go from somewhere else. That's how they rebuilt themselves in the 50s with the Turks and others. It's how the Dutch did it, and it will have to be that case. And if you don't, you're just going to be a faltering economy, and you will have problems that way. That's how it's going to be resolved. The question is, how big is the crisis? How quickly is it going to come? And how quickly is it going to be the response to deal with it? And wouldn't it be good if we actually understood it? We don't have to do any of it. We could just have a normal immigration policy, which, by the way, we had for most of our history.
But didn't reform it.
Well, we didn't reform because we politicized it, right? And who was the most pro-immigration president in the last 100 years? His name was Ronald Wilson Reagan. And wish the Republicans would remember that. Their great hero, at least it used to be their great hero, should be their great hero.
Elise?
Thank you for this great discussion, and to the council and to the Rita and the Hauser Foundation for such a wonderful symposium. I want to go back to the idea of autocracies versus democracies that we were talking about earlier, and the idea that around the world, so there are some polls that show that people are turning away from democracy. And so, President Biden used to say, we have to show, the whole idea was democracy versus autocracy. We have to show that democracies deliver. But I'm not sure that that promise has been, not just by President Biden, I mean, over time, that democracy does deliver. And so you're looking at people in countries that are saying, okay, we don't love a strong man, but this is someone that could get stuff done. And how do you fight that narrative that democracies don't deliver and it's not worth it if we can just get a strong man that can just get the job done? And I think that's the narrative that President Trump certainly is pushing in his agenda. Thank you.
Well, the good news is we'll soon find out whether whether he is going to be able to deliver or not. But no. But no. The point is well taken. But I'd make two fundamental observations. One in contesting it or reminding us, and the other sort of buying into it. If you look at who are the wealthiest, most prosperous, countries in the world, happiest, most law-abiding, least, most accountable, least impunity. I've been working with David Miliband for years on an impunity atlas to demonstrate how much impunity there is. They're democracies, particularly northern democracies, which are more capitalist, by the way, than the United States economy, but that's different. Out of conversation for another time. Oceania, it's the advanced industrial democracies. That's where people are happiest. They live longest. They are more prosperous, wealthier than they are in any other place. So that's the answer. Democracy has demonstrated, it has a record. Yes, the Chinese have grown faster than any other country, but their baseline was 0. And therefore and there's still 450 to 500 million people in poverty. We have too many people in poverty, but it isn't the same thing. But, and here's the but, anyone under the age of 40 in the United States hasn't had the same experience in the way that the grand history of the last 100 years has had. And that's our problem. If I look at my kids who are in their late 20s, their experience is 9/11 and the response to 9/11, the financial crisis, Donald Trump, and Donald Trump, and it's not and COVID and Donald Trump. That's their experience. I mean, my experience was my parents were liberated, one surviving the Holocaust, the other one from an occupation by the Germans. And my experience was, my first real big thing was the moon, was circling the moon. John Glenn in space. And, that was my experience. So that's the problem. The problem is that in the last 20 to 30 years, we haven't delivered enough. But we still delivered a hell of a lot more than anybody else. And so part of it is to remind people that delivery needs to improve and that we have to address the problems, and that remind them that the way some people are proposing to do that. I mean, the idea that the car industry, that our future economy depends on having more cars being built in the United States. It's like, really? Particularly when they're all combustion engine. When the Chinese are building them for like $8,000 a buck, because after all, a car these days is not combustion engine; it's a chip, 4 tires, and a battery. That's what a car is. It's pretty simple to build. And so, if you think you want to compete in that traditional way, you're going to lose. Not only do the Chinese, but you lose the idea that democracy can still provide for the future. And that's the challenge that we have. And I think Biden tried to address it not particularly well. I think Trump is trying to address it, and we'll find out how it ends up.
Heather?
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job.
Okay, I think we can take maybe 1 or 2 more. In the back there, please.
It was really just a follow-up question to Elise. Yeah, I'm Jeff. I'm Jeff Maurer with S&P Global Platts. It's very good answers, but I'm curious what you think about the expansion of executive power. Like, it seems to me like like kind of following along what Elise was saying, like people, every time their person gets in office, they're okay with that power being expanded. And it's been going on for decades. And I'm not sure what's the pitch now? Like when you talk about values, what's the argument? It seems like only like, you know, the Libertarian Party, which polls at what, you know, 2% or something, is the only one that would be serious about limiting executive power. Anyway.
And maybe just to build on that
Yeah.
a little bit, the crisis of confidence is coming from the left and the right in terms of how government has functioned. And we have DOGE on the one side, and then we have the abundance agenda on the other, which says regulation is what has sunk us and tied us down. And so
I wouldn't want to say that Ezra Klein is the future of the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
I
but
like Ezra, but that's a
yeah, but I think it's resonating with people.
So I think if I can take it's a great question. And again, this problem just didn't arrive. We've been working on this one for 30 plus years. I would argue some of that post-Cold War that would sort of allowed us to expand. And I think this was the political cost of our own political polarization. So in some ways, when we vote, the American people always wanted those houses, the Senate and the House, to be very equally divided. And political parties didn't want the party in charge to achieve success. So they just filibustered themselves. They wouldn't move things. They wouldn't reform important institutions and immigration. And so what happened is the executive said, all right, I got to get something moving here. Here's my executive order. Here's my executive order. The problem is it wasn't legislated, and it didn't have permanence, and it didn't have bipartisanship. And so when the next party comes in, what do? They wipe everything out, and then they do their thing. And I would say, I'm going to just pull this to foreign policy because what I love, just this observation. Every time I'm on a foreign policy panel, Ivo, I don't know if you have this experience, we end up having a really important conversation about ourselves. And I think that is the most important conversation to have. But this is about the system that we want and the values that we want to project. So just a commentary on that. But the executive orders also impact foreign policy because we lost bipartisanship on foreign policy too. And so when this happens, we get these wild swings, and our allies can't follow us anymore because we sign on to Kyoto and the Paris climate change, and then we're out. And then we do this, and then we're out. But we can't advance as a nation either based on a bipartisan vision of where we want to be because we keep doing these wild swings. So this executive order itis, which I understand the frustration. We must be able to have a vision to move on until we create a bipartisanship, until our leaders cross the aisle and say, I'm doing this one for the country, not for the party or for the win. We've lost that ability. And I don't know what national emergency it needs to slap us out of this, but I feel like we're rolling towards one. Maybe this is the ultimate silver lining in this, but that is my frustration. And both parties are guilty of it. And the system and Congress is guilty of it. And in some ways, the American people are a little guilty of it too. You wanted this half and half, but now we got something that we can't agree on.
But I'll add two things because I completely
This
agree.
is not the conversation I thought we'd have on our four adversaries.
Yeah, well, that's,
As you say, it turns
because we're part of
inevitably
it.
to ourselves. Yeah.
I mean, one, I think you're exactly right. Right. I think the growth of executive power is the most dangerous thing, mainly for a reason that I think Heather's really well articulated. I think its underlying core and cause is our democracy is deeply broken in a very fundamental way, in part because of a series of decisions that have been made, mainly by the Supreme Court. Citizens United will be regarded as one of the worst decisions any Supreme Court has ever, maybe constitutionally legal, but the political consequences of the amount of money that is making itself into this system is extraordinary. I mean, the only reason that Elon Musk is sitting where he's sitting now is because of Citizens United, for no other reason. Wouldn't have happened if we'd had normal ways of doing business. And by the way, it was Barack Obama who walked away from government funding of presidential elections when he decided that he didn't want matching. He could raise more than else. So this, in that sense, it's totally bipartisan. So that's number one. Number two is we don't have a competitive democracy anymore. We have the re-election of incumbents, many of whom are actually running unopposed, because the only thing that matters in their districts is whether they can head off a primary from somebody further to the right or the left. And so you don't have competitive democracies. If the gerrymandering, which is now, by the way, the Supreme Court has said, legal, as long as it's political, which is a remarkable statement, think about it, has destroyed our competitive democracy, which therefore leads to the kind of polarization where the only thing that matters is winning, not to govern, but to win. And that leads the executives then to say, well, I can't govern with the legislature, therefore I have to do it by myself. So we have a broken, deeply broken political system that has very little to do with the election of Donald Trump. I'm not even mentioning the Electoral College, which I think is a completely different issue. And if you didn't have a broken political system, you wouldn't have to deal with that issue. But nobody's talking about it. We're not talking about Supreme Court reform. We're not talking about the fact that the United States House of Representatives has had 435 members since, Jim, correct me, 1909? 1909, when we were a third the size we are today. Stunning. So the only way I know and how we can, let me end with this if I can, save our democracy is to bring in the 10 provinces from Canada into the United States and then have the Canadians insist that they will only come in if we adopt their political system.
Wow. We could all fantasize. But I want to,
All right, if not that, how about some of us join Canada?
They each province becomes a state. That could work. I don't know when this event was first conceived, if it was before or after the advent of the Trump administration, but I think what it has shown is how important it is for us to come together to distill and digest what we are witnessing, what we are living through, to begin to think about how we manage and respond. And I think the council is really the perfect place for people of all sorts of backgrounds to converge for those discussions. And so I felt a certain urgency in the room and on the stage this afternoon. And I want to thank Ivo and Heather for being here, and Rita Hauser and the council and all the staff who worked on this extraordinary event.
Thank you.